My name is Clara. I'm in my late 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of person people describe as reliable. The one who shows up early, listens more than she speaks, and doesn't make scenes. I work with documents, timelines, and other people's priorities. I've built a life that looks quiet from the outside, stable, orderly, unremarkable in the way that makes others feel comfortable around you. People often mistake quiet for softness, or for agreement, or for a lack of awareness. They assume that because I don't interrupt, I don't notice. Because I don't argue, I don't remember. Because I don't demand space, I don't deserve it. In my family, especially, I was rarely seen as someone whose perspective needed to be heard, just someone who would eventually adapt. This story isn't about a sudden transformation or a dramatic showdown. It's about accumulation, about what happens when small moments of dismissal pile up over years, and how silence can slowly change its meaning. It's also about something very specific that happened, something that still sounds unreal when I say it out loud. My family took a vote on whether I deserved my inheritance, and in that meeting, I wasn't allowed to speak at the meeting. I want to be clear about what this story is and what it isn't. It isn't a revenge fantasy, there are no villains twirling, no explosive confrontations, no public humiliation. There's no shouting, no triumphal music swelling at the end. What there is, or what I'll try to give you, is honesty. The kind that's sometimes uncomfortable because it doesn't dress itself up as justice or forgiveness. It just tells the truth as it unfolded. Emotionally, this is a story that moves slowly. It begins with how I was seen, then how I learned to see myself differently. It passes through disappointment, clarity, restraint, and consequence. Not everything resolves neatly, but everything becomes clear. And clarity, I've learned, can be more powerful than closure. If you've ever been the person everyone relies on but rarely consults, if you've ever stayed quiet, not because you had nothing to say, but because speaking felt pointless, if you've ever been underestimated in a room where decisions about your life were being made, then you might recognize yourself somewhere in what I'm about to tell you. Before we go any further, let me ask you something, gently and without expectation. Have you ever realized, a little too late, that silence had become a role others were counting on you to play? To my family, I was never a problem that needed solving. And because of that, I was never a person who needed to be listened to. I was the one who answered emails quickly, the one who remembered birthdays without reminders, the one who filled out forms correctly the first time, who kept copies just in case, who knew where the spare keys were and which drawer held the old documents no one wanted to sort through. When someone said, "Clara will know," it wasn't praise, it was shorthand for convenience. At family gatherings, I was often physically present but conversationally optional. My role was logistical: coordinate arrival teams, make sure dietary restrictions were remembered, and help clean up without being asked. I learned early that usefulness earned me a seat in the room, but not a voice in the discussion. When conversations drifted toward decisions, opinions, or disagreements, my presence became almost decorative. I was there to nod, not to contribute. No one ever told me to be quiet. That's the part people misunderstand. Silence was never enforced, it was assumed. When I did speak, people listened politely in the way you listen to background music, aware of it, but not changed by it. Someone would say, "That's a good point," and then continue exactly as they had before. Over time, I stopped confusing politeness with consideration. I don't say this with bitterness. At the time, I didn't even recognize it as exclusion. I told myself a more flattering story, that I was mature, that I didn't need validation, that staying out of conflict was a strength. And in many ways it was. I avoided unnecessary friction. I kept relationships smooth. I became someone others trusted with responsibility, because I never complicated things by having feelings at inconvenient moments. In my family, personalities were clearly ranked. There were the outspoken ones, whose emotions set the temperature of the room. There were the negotiators, who enjoyed debate and tension. And then there was me, the stabilizer, the one everyone assumed would be fine no matter what happened. That assumption followed me everywhere. If a plan changed last minute, I adapted. If someone forgot to include me, I adjusted. If a decision affected me directly, I absorbed it quietly. I became very good at absorbing. What no one noticed was how closely I paid attention while doing it. I noticed who spoke first and who always spoke last. I noticed which opinions were treated as emotional and which were framed as practical, even when they said the same thing. I noticed how often my name came up in conversations I wasn't part of, usually attached to a task, rarely to a question. At work, this same pattern played out, but with clearer rules. Titles mattered, processes existed, silence had boundaries. In my family, everything was informal, which meant power moved quietly and without accountability. Decisions happened over dinner, over jokes, over assumptions that didn't need to be stated because everyone knew. Everyone except me. Or maybe especially me. I remember once, years before anything truly shifted, someone jokingly said, "Clara doesn't really mind either way." It was said lightly, affectionately even. Everyone laughed. I smiled because correcting it felt unnecessary. But something about that sentence stayed with me. Not because it was cruel, but because it was inaccurate. I didn't mind. I simply hadn't learned how to make that visible without becoming a problem. That was who I was to them: dependable, neutral, low maintenance. Someone whose silence was interpreted as consent, whose adaptability was mistaken for agreement. I wasn't invisible in the dramatic sense. I was visible in the way furniture is visible, noticed when missing, rarely acknowledged when present. And I accepted that role for a long time, not because I thought it was fair, but because it felt easier than renegotiating my place in a system that benefited from me staying exactly where I was. At that point in my life, I still believed that being needed was close enough to being respected. I hadn't yet learned the difference. The first time something shifted, it didn't announce itself as harm. It arrived as a comment so ordinary that, if I repeated it now, most people would tell me I was overreacting. We were in my aunt's kitchen, late afternoon light coming in at an angle that made everything look softer than it was. Papers were spread across the table, insurance forms, a draft of a will, notes scribbled in the margins. This was still before anyone talked openly about inheritance. Officially, we were just getting organized. Someone asked a question about beneficiaries. Not my name, just a general question. I answered it accurately because I had been the one asked to review the documents earlier that week. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't interrupt. I just filled in a gap. My uncle didn't look at me when he responded. He looked at someone else and said, "Well, that's one way of looking at it. Not wrong, not unnecessary, just one way." The conversation moved on without incorporating anything I had said. A few minutes later, the same point came up again, this time phrased differently by someone else. That version was discussed seriously. Adjustments were suggested. Pens moved. Notes were added. No one acknowledged that the idea had already been offered. I felt something tighten in my chest. But it wasn't anger. It was recognition. The quiet, unpleasant clarity of realizing this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a pattern revealing itself in miniature. I told myself it didn't matter, that I wasn't there to be credited. The outcomes were more important than ego, and on the surface, that was true. The document improved. The decision made sense. No damage done. Except there was damage, it just didn't show. That evening, as I drove home, I replayed the moment in my head, not with outrage, but with curiosity. I noticed how natural it had felt for everyone else to continue as if I hadn't spoken. How natural it had felt for me to let them. That part unsettled me more than the dismissal itself, because it wasn't new. It was simply the first time I'd paused long enough to see it clearly. After that, similar moments became easier to spot. A suggestion overlooked until echoed. A concern reframed as worry when I raised it, then as foresight when someone else did. Each instance is small enough to dismiss, reasonable enough to explain away. Death by politeness. And every time I chose the same response, none. Not because I was afraid to speak up, but because the cost-benefit calculation never seemed to favor confrontation. Correcting the record would slow things down. Insisting on acknowledgement would shift the mood. I would become sensitive, or worse, difficult. The group's comfort always seemed more valuable than my accuracy, so I adapted. I spoke less. I offered information only when asked directly. I framed everything cautiously, with disclaimers and softened edges, as if pre-apologizing for taking up space. What I didn't realize then was that this adaptation was teaching everyone else how to treat me. Each time I let a small cut pass without comment, it confirmed a quiet agreement that my contributions were optional, that my presence didn't change the outcome enough to require engagement. The most unsettling part wasn't that they dismissed me. It was that they did it without malice, without awareness, without any sense that something was being taken. That made it harder to object. You can argue with intent. You can't argue with indifference. That night, I wrote a short note in my planner. Just a sentence. No emotion attached. Pay attention to who speaks and who is responded to. I didn't know why I wrote it. I just knew I needed to remember that moment, even if no one else would. Once you notice a pattern, you start seeing it everywhere. Not because it suddenly appears, but because you stop filtering it out. In the months that followed, the small cuts multiplied. None of them is dramatic enough to point to. None of them was severe enough to justify a scene. Together, they formed something heavier, a constant, low-level erosion of relevance. Family discussions began to follow a familiar rhythm. Someone would ask for my help before a meeting, documents, summaries, context. I would provide it carefully and thoroughly. During the meeting itself, I would sit quietly while those same points were debated, reshaped, and sometimes misunderstood. When I tried to clarify, my voice landed softly and disappeared. I told myself a story that made this easier to live with. They're not ignoring me. They're just used to me handling things. Another version went, they don't push back on you because they trust you. Both explanations allowed me to remain calm, reasonable, and unthreatening. Both also required me to accept less and less visibility. Over time, I stopped offering unsolicited insight altogether. Not consciously at first, just a subtle tightening. A pause before speaking that grew longer each time. A habit of waiting to be invited that eventually became permanent. Silence became my default setting. What surprised me was how little anyone noticed the change. No one asked why I'd gone quiet. No one said, "Clara, what do you think?" Unless a technical detail was missing. My reduced presence didn't create a void because my role had never been about perspective. It had been about the function. As long as the machinery kept running, the operator didn't matter. I remember one particular conversation about future arrangements. Still vague, still unofficial. Someone said, "We'll figure out what's fair later." The word fair hung in the air, undefined and unquestioned. I almost laughed, not because it was absurd, but because fairness, in this context, had nothing to do with balance or contribution. It meant whatever caused the least friction among the loudest people in the room. I noticed how often my silence was interpreted as agreement. Decisions would be summarized with phrases like, "So we're all on the same page," followed by glances that skipped right over me. I could have objected. I could have said, "Actually, I'm not." But doing so would have required me to first undo the assumption that my lack of objection equaled consent. And that felt like too much work for a system that wasn't interested in change. So I normalized it. I told myself that this was just how families function. Those roles emerge organically. That mine happened to be supportive rather than directive. There was comfort in that explanation. It allowed me to remain generous in my interpretation of others' behavior and dismissive of my own discomfort. But normalization has a cost. Each time I swallowed a reaction, I trained myself to accept a slightly smaller share of the space. Each time I rationalized someone else's dismissal, I eroded my own sense of entitlement to be heard. Not in a dramatic way, just enough to make silence feel like the responsible choice. The irony is that I wasn't passive. Internally, I was more alert than ever. I listened closely. I remembered details others forgot. I began keeping copies of emails, drafts of documents, and timelines of conversations. Not out of suspicion, at least not consciously, but out of habit. I liked having a clear record. It made me feel grounded in something factual when everything else felt negotiable. Looking back, that was the beginning of a shift I didn't yet understand. I thought I was withdrawing. In reality, I was observing. Disrespect, when it's loud, invites resistance. When it's quiet, it invites adaptation. I adapted so well that even I started to believe this was simply who I was. The calm one, the flexible one, the one who didn't need much. What I didn't realize was that by normalizing being dismissed, I was also being prepared for something much larger than a missed comment or an overlooked idea. I just didn't know it yet. It took longer than I like to admit for me to understand that what I was experiencing wasn't accidental. It was structural. Every system, formal or not, assigns roles. Some are spoken out loud, most are not. Mine had been assigned so early and reinforced so gently that I'd mistaken it for personality. I was the reliable one, the one who didn't complicate things, the one who would handle it without needing to be thanked or consulted. When plans were discussed, my role was assumed rather than negotiated. If something needed to be done, I was included. If something needed to be decided, I was not. No one ever said Clara doesn't get a say. They didn't have to. The structure did that work for them. I started to notice how often my usefulness was praised in place of my judgment. You're so organized. You're so calm about these things. You're good at keeping everything together. These were compliments technically, but they also functioned as boundaries. They defined the limits of my contribution. Execution, not authorship. When I tried gently to step outside that role, the system corrected itself. If I expressed an opinion that introduced complexity, it was met with reassurance. Don't worry about that. If I asked a question that challenged an assumption, it was framed as anxiety. You're overthinking it. If I disagreed outright, the mood shifted just enough to signal that I was disrupting something delicate. So I learned to stay within the edges of what was expected of me. The most telling moment came during a conversation that wasn't even about inheritance yet, just responsibilities. Someone said, Clara's good with the details. We don't need to get her involved in the bigger picture. It was said casually, without cruelty, and no one objected. Not even me. I nodded because that was what the role required. Inside, something settled. Not hurt exactly, more like resignation. A quiet understanding that my value, as they saw it, was conditional. I mattered as long as I made things easier. The moment I made them harder, even in pursuit of fairness, I became misaligned with the group. From that point on, expectations tightened. I was looped in late. Information arrived after decisions had already been shaped. When I asked clarifying questions, they were answered kindly, but briefly, as if the goal was to keep me informed, not involved. And again, I told myself a comforting story. This is just efficiency. Not everyone needs to be part of every decision. That story allowed me to preserve my image of my family as reasonable, well-intentioned people. It also required me to ignore the growing gap between what I contributed and what I was allowed to influence. What I didn't fully grasp then was that roles, once accepted, become self-reinforcing. The less I spoke, the less I was expected to, the stranger it would seem if I suddenly did. Silence, over time, becomes not just behavior, but identity. I wasn't invisible, I was categorized. And categories are efficient. They reduce friction. They allow groups to move quickly without renegotiating power. My family moved very quickly, especially when the outcome benefited them. By the time I noticed how narrow my role had become, it felt almost inappropriate to challenge it, like rearranging furniture in someone else's house. I had helped build the structure by complying with it. Undoing that felt impolite. So I stayed where I was, reliable, useful, quiet. What I didn't realize was that this role, so comfortable for everyone else, was about to place me directly in the path of a decision that would force me to choose between remaining invisible and becoming something else entirely. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no raised voice, no accusation, no dramatic line in the sand. In fact, it happened on a day that would have been forgettable if not for what followed. I was alone, reviewing a set of documents I'd been asked to organize. Nothing urgent, nothing sensitive, at least not on the surface. Just the usual mixture of notes, drafts, and attachments, forwarded without much explanation. I remember the light outside had already started to fade, that muted gray that makes everything feel suspended. As I worked, I noticed a discrepancy, a small one, a date that didn't align with a previous version. A name was missing where it had appeared before. It wasn't alarming, but it was odd, enough to slow me down. I cross-referenced it with an older file, then another. The pattern emerged quietly, without fanfare. Information was being filtered before it reached me. Not incorrectly, selectively. I was being given enough to perform my tasks, but not enough to understand the full shape of what was forming. That realization landed differently than the earlier dismissals. It wasn't personal. It was procedural. I sat back and let that settle. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to correct or clarify. I didn't draft an email asking for context. I didn't flag the inconsistency. I just observed it the way you observe a crack in a structure you once trusted. What shifted wasn't my opinion of them. It was my understanding of my position. Up until that moment, I had believed that my silence was a byproduct of harmony, that speaking up wasn't necessary because nothing was being decided without care. But this was care with boundaries, inclusion with limits, transparency calibrated to my assigned role, and suddenly staying quiet no longer felt like maturity. It felt like compliance. That was the moment I realized I had been waiting, without knowing it, for permission. Permission to step out of the role I'd been given. Permission to ask different questions. Permission to see the system as it was, not as I wanted it to be. No one gave me that permission. I took it. Internally, something hardened. Not in anger, but in resolve. I stopped telling myself stories that softened the edges of what I was experiencing. I stopped assuming good intentions where patterns existed. I didn't replace those assumptions with suspicion. I replaced them with attention. That night, instead of closing my planner, I opened a new section. I didn't label it. I didn't write anything dramatic. I just began recording facts, dates, versions, who said what and when, what I was included in, and what arrived after decisions had already been made. It felt strangely calm, almost grounding. I didn't plan to use any of it. There was no endgame in mind. This wasn't a strategy yet. It was orientation, like turning a map the right way up after walking with it upside down for years. The most important change was invisible. I stopped assuming that silence was the safest choice. I started seeing it as one option among many, a tool, not a reflex. Nothing changed on the outside. I continued to respond promptly. I continued to be helpful. I continued to play my role well enough that no one questioned it. But internally, the relationship had shifted. I was no longer participating on trust alone. I was participating with awareness. And once you see clearly, you can't unsee it. After that day, my silence changed texture. From the outside, nothing was different. I was still the calm one, the accommodating one, the person who didn't push. But internally, each moment of restraint was deliberate. I was no longer quiet because I felt it was expected of me. I was quiet because it gave me information. When you stop speaking, people reveal more than they intend to. They fill the space. They explain themselves. They repeat assumptions out loud because no one is challenging them. I listened carefully, not with suspicion, but with precision. I noticed how often decisions were framed as already settled before they were announced. We've more or less agreed. Everyone seems comfortable with. Language like that does important work. It creates momentum. It discourages dissent without ever forbidding it. And I noticed something else. No one checked whether I was comfortable. That wasn't new. What was new was my response to it. I stopped correcting the record. I stopped offering clarifications that benefited everyone but me. If someone misunderstood a detail that didn't affect my responsibilities, I let it stand. Not out of spite, out of neutrality. I was done compensating for systems that didn't compensate for me. This restraint wasn't easy. There were moments when speaking up would have been efficient, when a single sentence from me could have prevented confusion later. But I resisted that impulse, because clarity delivered too early often benefits the wrong people. Silence, I learned, creates asymmetry. The person who speaks assumes they are being heard. The person who listens decides what matters. Others began to mistake my quiet for acquiescence. I could see it in the way conversations ended more quickly, in the way plans were summarized without pause. My lack of objection was taken as alignment. That assumption became a liability for them. I continued documenting, not obsessively, just accurately. I kept copies of emails where decisions were implied but never stated. I noted that when I was excluded from threads I had previously been part of, I paid attention to timelines, to who initiated conversations and who benefited from their outcomes. There was no anger in this process. If anything, there was relief. I no longer felt the low-grade tension of deciding whether to speak. I had already decided. Silence was my default, but now it was active, not passive. The irony is that people became more comfortable around me during this period. Without my gentle interruptions or clarifying questions, things felt smoother, more decisive. They interpreted that ease as proof that everything was fair, that everyone was aligned. No one suspects the person who makes things easier. I also began to notice how often my contributions were referenced after the fact. As Clara organized, based on the notes Clara put together, my work was everywhere, my voice was nowhere, and that, paradoxically, gave me leverage. Because when your fingerprints are on everything, but your consent is nowhere documented, responsibility becomes traceable. I didn't know yet what I would do with that. I didn't even know if I would do anything at all. What I knew was this: I was no longer waiting to be invited into the conversation. I was observing the conversation from a position of clarity. Silence, when chosen, is not absence. It's presence without exposure. And for the first time, I felt present in a way that didn't require permission. While everyone else moved forward, assuming the structure was stable, I began to see its seams. What they never noticed was how much access my role gave me. I wasn't in the room when decisions were framed, but I touched nearly everything that made those decisions possible. Drafts passed through my hands. Attachments were forwarded to me for safekeeping. I was copied for record keeping, not for input. And because I never challenged that boundary, no one thought to reinforce it. Preparation didn't look like plotting. It looked like competence. I organized files more carefully than before. I created timelines that linked conversations to documents, drafts to approvals. I saved versions instead of overwriting them. When something arrived without context, I archived it with the date and sender intact. When instructions were vague, I completed the task exactly as written. No extrapolation, no interpretation. This was new. Previously, I would have filled in gaps instinctively. I would have clarified intent, smoothed inconsistencies, and anticipated needs that were never articulated. That kind of labor is invisible by design. It makes systems appear more coherent than they are. I stopped doing that. As a result, small cracks began to show, quietly, and without my involvement. Someone would ask why a document didn't reflect a conversation they swore had happened. I would check my records and respond neutrally. That change wasn't included in what I received. No accusation, just a fact. No one questioned it. I also began learning, deliberately, not in a dramatic way. I read policies. I familiarized myself with the language of estate planning, not as a participant, but as an observer. I learned how decisions become binding, how assumptions harden into precedent, how silence can be interpreted legally, and how documentation can interrupt that interpretation. None of this was secret. That's the part that still surprises me. I wasn't hiding. I was just no longer volunteering explanations. The family continued to underestimate me, but in a specific way. They saw me as thorough, not strategic, careful, not consequential. They assumed my attention to detail was about order, not leverage. They didn't notice when I stopped answering questions that hadn't been asked. They didn't notice when I began responding in writing instead of verbally. They didn't notice that my planner was no longer just a tool for organization, but a record of sequence and causality. Invisibility is a strange kind of cover. It doesn't draw suspicion. It draws reliance. There was a moment, brief, easily missed, when someone joked, "Clara keeps better records than the bank." It was meant as praise. I smiled. Inside, I registered it as confirmation. By this point, I still hadn't decided to act. Preparation wasn't a commitment, it was insurance. I wasn't building a case against anyone. I was building a clear account of reality, one that didn't depend on memory or consensus. What they never noticed was that the system they were using to manage the future relied heavily on someone they weren't including in shaping it. They assumed alignment where there was none, consent where there was only silence. And silence, when documented, stops being ambiguous. I didn't feel powerful during this period. I felt steady, grounded in facts rather than feelings. That steadiness changed how I moved through the world. I slept better, I reacted less. I stopped replaying conversations in my head because I had them on record. The shift was subtle, but it was real. I was no longer preparing to be heard. I was preparing for the moment when hearing me would no longer be optional. The reveal didn't come with a rush of adrenaline. There was no shock, no sense of triumph. It arrived the way clarity often does, quietly, after enough pieces have already fallen into place. I was reviewing a set of finalized documents that I hadn't been involved in drafting. That wasn't unusual anymore. What was unusual was how familiar they felt. The language echoed earlier versions I had archived. Phrases reappeared, assumptions repeated, omissions preserved. It was all very consistent. Too consistent. I laid everything out on my desk. Past drafts, emails, notes from meetings I hadn't attended, timelines I'd been keeping without knowing exactly why. I didn't do this with a goal in mind. I just wanted to see it all at once. And then I saw it. Not a single explosive flaw. Not fraud, not malice, not anything dramatic enough to point at and say this is wrong. What I saw was something far more decisive, a pattern of procedural exclusion that had consequences. Decisions about my future had been shaped in my absence, justified by my silence, and finalized using my work. Legally, that mattered, not because it was illegal, but because it was fragile. The structure relied on a narrative that I had been informed, included, and agreeable. My records told a different story, one that didn't accuse, one that simply showed the sequence. Here is when information was requested from me. Here is when decisions were discussed without me. Here is when outcomes were finalized. No commentary, no interpretation, just alignment, or lack of it. I felt something settle in my body then. Not satisfied, not anger, certainty. For the first time, I understood that my position wasn't weak. It was undefined. And undefined positions, when documented carefully, are surprisingly strong. I didn't celebrate. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't even reread everything right away. I closed the folders and put them away the same way I always did, with care, without ceremony. That night, I went for a walk. I remember noticing how ordinary everything felt. Streetlights, traffic, people walking dogs. The world hadn't changed. I had. What I had discovered wasn't leverage in the cinematic sense. It wasn't something to deploy aggressively. It was clarity about where power actually lived and how quietly it could shift when assumptions were questioned by facts. The most important part of that realization was restraint. Knowing something doesn't obligate you to use it immediately. In fact, using it too early often destroys its value. So I waited. I continued exactly as before. I answered emails, I organized files. I said very little. If anything, I became more agreeable, more neutral. I let them believe the story they were telling themselves, that everything was settled, that I was aligned, that silence meant peace. Privately, I adjusted one thing. I stopped asking myself whether I deserved a say. That question had kept me small for years. In its place, I asked something much more useful. What is true, and what is merely assumed? The answer to that question changed everything. Once you see clearly, inaction becomes a choice rather than a default, and every choice has a cost. I spent weeks sitting with what I knew, not because I was afraid to act, but because I wanted to understand the full range of consequences. There were multiple paths available to me, each with its own weight. I could have confronted them early, asked for inclusion, corrected the narrative while it was still forming. That path would have required vulnerability, naming the pattern, risking dismissal, reopening dynamics that everyone else found comfortable. It might have led to surface-level concessions. It also might have reinforced the very role I was trying to step out of. I could have walked away entirely, detached myself emotionally, declined further involvement, and let the system proceed without me. That would have protected my peace, but it would have left the underlying assumptions intact. Silence without documentation is easily rewritten. Or I could do what felt, at the time, almost impersonal, allow the process to complete under its own assumptions, while ensuring that reality was recorded accurately enough to matter later. That was the irreversible option. Choosing it meant accepting a certain kind of loneliness. I wouldn't be able to explain myself along the way. I wouldn't get reassurance that I was doing the right thing. I would have to tolerate being misunderstood, perhaps permanently. But it also meant I wouldn't have to argue about my worth in a room that had already decided how much space I was allowed. The turning point came during a brief exchange, nothing dramatic. Someone forwarded me a summary of decisions with a line at the end. Let us know if this works for you. It was presented as inclusion, but it came after everything had been settled. I stared at that sentence for a long time. In the past, I would have responded with a carefully worded message, something polite, something non-committal, something that preserved harmony while quietly erasing my own objections. This time I responded with 2 words: received, thank you. No endorsement, no objection, just acknowledgement. That email marked the moment when I stopped trying to be understood and started focusing on being accurate. I wasn't signaling agreement, I was preserving the sequence. From that point on, my behavior was consistent and minimal. I didn't introduce new information unless asked. I didn't correct misunderstandings that didn't affect my responsibilities. I didn't challenge the framing that excluded me. Not because I agreed, but because challenging it would have collapsed the very structure that was making my position clear. I understood then that whatever came next would change my relationship with my family. Not explosively, gradually, in ways that couldn't be undone once the implications became visible. This wasn't revenge. There was no satisfaction in letting people proceed under false assumptions. There was only acceptance. Acceptance that fairness wasn't going to be negotiated in conversation. It would have to be recognized in consequence. I chose the path that required the least performance and the most patience. And once that choice was made, there was no going back. After the decision was made, everything became strangely simple. There were no secret meetings, no dramatic pivots, no moment where I took action in a way that would have looked meaningful from the outside. What changed was the consistency of my restraint. When documents arrived, I archived them exactly as received. When I was asked to coordinate, I did so without adding interpretation. When someone assumed alignment, I didn't correct them, and I didn't confirm it either. I stopped translating intention into clarity for others. I let intent stand on its own. This had a quiet but measurable effect. Processes that once relied on my invisible labor began to feel slower, though no one could quite explain why. Emails grew longer. Follow-up questions increased. People referenced conversations that hadn't been documented, and for the first time, that mattered. I began responding almost exclusively in writing, not coldly, just precisely. Short confirmations, neutral language, no emotional coloring. My tone gave nothing away, which made it impossible to project agreement onto it. Behind the scenes, I did take action, but only the kind that aligned with my role. I consulted professionals quietly, asking narrow questions framed around documentation and sequence, not outcome. I didn't ask, "What should I do?" I asked, "What does this record show?" And "How is consent typically established?" Those questions had clear answers. I updated my own records methodically. Nothing dramatic, just alignment. Every version is dated, every exchange is saved, every assumption is traceable to its origin. I wasn't creating evidence, I was preserving it. What struck me during this time was how invisible preparation remains when it doesn't disrupt anyone else's comfort. No one checks on the quiet person who continues to deliver. No one questions the neutral presence that never resists. They assumed I was still playing my role. In truth, I was no longer participating in the outcome, only in the process. That distinction mattered more than they realized. There were moments when someone would ask, almost casually, "You're okay with all this, right?" I would pause, just long enough to register the question, and then respond with something factual. "I've noted the timeline," or "I have the documents." They heard reassurance. I offered none. This period required patience, not the passive kind, but the disciplined kind, the kind where you resist the urge to explain yourself, even when explanation would be easier in the short term. The kind where you trust that clarity, once documented, doesn't expire. Nothing exploded, nothing cracked visibly, but the weight of assumption was being carried forward without reinforcement. And weight, when unsupported, always reveals its limits, eventually. I wasn't moving against them, I was moving with time. And time, when paired with accurate records, has a way of speaking on your behalf. The first signs of consequence didn't look like consequences at all. They looked confused. Someone noticed that a document didn't reflect what they remembered agreeing to. Another person was surprised by a timeline they thought had been flexible, but was now fixed. There were small moments of friction, nothing alarming, just enough to make people slow down and look twice. Questions started to circulate, not directed at me, at first. They were spoken into the room, into email threads, into half-joking comments about how complicated things had become. I watched them closely, not with satisfaction, but with a kind of clinical interest. Because I recognized what was happening. The system had been running on assumptions, and assumptions, once challenged by sequence, begin to fail quietly. Someone forwarded me a message asking if I had a record of a conversation that supposedly changed a key detail. I checked my files and responded honestly. I had no record of that change being communicated to me. No accusation, just absence. That absence carried weight. Another time, someone asked why a certain option hadn't been explored. I replied that it hadn't been raised in the materials I was given. Again, no commentary, just a fact. Slowly, the tone shifted. Where there had once been confidence, there was now uncertainty. Where decisions had been summarized quickly, they were now revisited. People began speaking more carefully, qualifying statements that used to be delivered as certainty. What they were feeling wasn't betrayal, it was disorientation. They had believed the process was collaborative, that everyone important had been included, that silence meant alignment. My records didn't contradict them directly, but they no longer supported that belief. And without that support, the narrative weakened. I could sense the discomfort growing, even though no one named it. People don't like realizing that their certainty rested on unexamined assumptions, especially when those assumptions benefited them. Someone remarked, half seriously, "We should have been clearer earlier." It was the closest thing to an admission I would hear for a while. It wasn't addressed to me, it didn't need to be. I remained steady. I didn't push. I didn't clarify beyond what was asked. I didn't frame the confusion as a problem to be solved, because it wasn't mine to solve. What struck me most was how quickly responsibility began to diffuse. When clarity disappears, people look for someone to restore it. For years, that had been me. This time, I didn't step in. And without that stabilizing force, the group felt the cost of its own shortcuts. These weren't dramatic consequences. No one stormed out. No voices were raised. But the ease was gone. The sense of inevitability had dissolved. Decisions now felt heavier, more fragile, because they were no longer insulated by my quiet compliance. I watched all of this with a calm I hadn't expected. Not because I felt vindicated, but because I finally understood that consequences don't need to be delivered. They emerge naturally when systems are asked to carry more weight than they were designed for. I hadn't changed the structure. I had simply stopped compensating for its weaknesses. And that was enough. By the time the concern became explicit, the window for easy correction had already closed. It started with urgency creeping into the tone of messages. Not panic yet, but a noticeable shift. Emails that once felt casual became carefully worded. Questions that used to be rhetorical now demanded answers. People began looping each other into threads unnecessarily, as if visibility itself could restore control. Someone finally reached out to me directly and asked if we could walk through everything together, just to be sure we're aligned. The phrasing was careful, collaborative. It arrived months after alignment was assumed. I agreed to the conversation, not because I thought it would change anything, but because clarity doesn't fear review. We sat at the same table where earlier conversations had happened. Papers spread out, familiar faces, the same soft light. On the surface, it looked like a reset. Underneath, it was a reckoning with sequence. They spoke first. They explained how they understood things had progressed. I listened without interruption. Then calmly, I opened my folder and laid out the record. Not as a rebuttal, as a timeline. I pointed out when I had been asked to prepare materials, when I had been excluded from discussions, when decisions had been summarized without my input. I didn't use charged language. I didn't say you or me more than necessary. I let the document speak. The room grew quiet, not tense, but heavy. This wasn't an argument. It was a realization. Someone said that wasn't our intention. I believed them. Intent wasn't the issue. The process was. Another person suggested we could revisit certain decisions. I acknowledged the suggestion. I also acknowledged the current state of things, what had already been finalized, what assumptions had already shaped outcomes. Revisiting wasn't impossible. It was just no longer simple. What they were experiencing was the delayed cost of exclusion. You can't retroactively include someone in decisions that have already been built on their absence. You can't easily unwind momentum without admitting where it came from. They were trying to fix something that had benefited from being invisible for too long. There was a moment, brief, unguarded, when someone looked at me and said almost incredulously, "Why didn't you say something sooner?" I answered honestly, "I did, and when it stopped making a difference, I stopped trying." That was the closest I came to an accusation. After that, the conversation lost its urgency, not because the issue was resolved, but because it was now understood. The problem wasn't a misunderstanding that could be patched with goodwill. It was structural. And structures, once exposed, don't go back to being invisible. They wanted restoration. What they got was clarity. By the time we left the table, nothing had been reversed. Some things couldn't be. Others would require more effort than anyone had anticipated. The ease they were trying to recover was already gone. And with it, the assumption that my silence had ever meant consent. What followed wasn't a confrontation in the way people imagine one. There were no raised voices, no tears, no dramatic declarations. If anything, it was almost anticlimactic. The conversation happened a few days later, in a smaller setting. Fewer people, less performance. The tone was careful, restrained, as if everyone had agreed, without saying so, that emotion would only complicate things. They asked me how I felt. It was a genuine question, also a late one. I told them the truth, but I told it plainly. I said I had felt useful but not included. I had noticed patterns long before I stopped speaking, that I didn't interpret their behavior as malicious, but I did experience it as decisive. Decisions had been made around me, and my silence had been mistaken for agreement. No metaphors, no history lessons, just facts and impact. Someone apologized, quietly. Another person explained their perspective, how things had moved quickly, how they assumed I would speak up if something mattered. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct their framing. Understanding didn't require endorsement. What surprised them most was my lack of heat. They seemed prepared for anger, for resentment, for a list of grievances. What they encountered instead was composure. Not coldness, just finality. I told them I wasn't interested in revisiting every decision. I wasn't looking for validation or restitution framed as kindness. What mattered to me now was accuracy, that my silence would no longer be interpreted on my behalf. The boundary landed heavily, because it meant the old dynamics couldn't quietly resume. It meant future decisions would require explicit inclusion, or explicit acknowledgement of exclusion. Either way, ambiguity was no longer an option. Someone asked carefully what I wanted moving forward. I paused before answering, not for effect, just to be precise. I want to be consulted when outcomes affect me, I said, and if I'm not, I want that to be clear. I won't fill in the gaps anymore. There was no argument against that, only discomfort. The conversation ended without resolution in the traditional sense. No promises were made, no systems were redesigned on the spot, but something essential had shifted. The illusion of harmony, maintained by my silence, was gone. In its place was a quieter, more honest tension. I left feeling neither relieved nor burdened, just settled. Confrontation doesn't require force when truth is delivered without ornament. It doesn't need heat when the facts are sufficient. What makes it effective isn't volume, it's inevitability. And this one had been inevitable for a long time. After everything settled, not resolved, but settled, I noticed something unexpected: the absence of noise. For years, there had been a low hum in the background of my life, the constant internal negotiation. Should I say something? Is this worth it? Am I overreacting? That hum was gone. In its place was a quiet I hadn't known how to access before. Nothing about my personality changed overnight. I didn't become louder. I didn't start asserting myself in every room. I didn't redefine myself through opposition. What changed was simpler and deeper. I stopped explaining my presence. I am still reliable, still organized, still calm, but those traits are no longer offered as proof of my harmlessness. They are simply aspects of who I am, not an invitation for others to decide how much space I deserve. My family interacts with me differently now, not dramatically, not always comfortably. There is more caution, more checking, fewer assumptions. Sometimes that feels like distance. Sometimes it feels like respect. Often, it feels like both. What matters is that the role I once occupied by default now requires intention. If I'm included, it's visible. If I'm not, that absence is explicit. There is no longer a version of events where my silence is rewritten as consent after the fact. I've learned that boundaries don't always look like walls. Sometimes they look like accuracy, like refusing to soften reality so others can move through it more easily, like allowing people to feel the consequences of their own shortcuts without rushing in to stabilize the outcome. I don't feel victorious. Victory implies defeat on the other side. What I feel is aligned. My actions match my values. My silence matches my intent. My presence no longer requires justification. There are moments of sadness, of course, not for what I lost, but for what might have been possible if clarity had arrived earlier. But I don't linger there. Regret is only useful if it informs something ahead of you. What defines me now isn't what I endured. It's what I no longer accept. I understand power differently than I used to. It isn't volume, it isn't dominance. It's the ability to remain precise under pressure, to let facts stand without defending them, to choose when and whether to engage. I still listen more than I speak. But when I do speak, it's because I intend to be part of the outcome, not because I'm trying to earn my place in it. That distinction has changed how I move through every part of my life, and I don't expect everyone to understand it. I no longer need them to. There's a temptation, at the end of stories like this, to offer a clean moral, a sentence you can carry with you and apply everywhere. But real experiences don't resolve that neatly. What they offer instead is perspective, something quieter and more enduring. For a long time, I believed that being easy to work with was the same as being respected. That if I stayed calm, adaptable, and useful, fairness would eventually find me. What I learned is that systems don't reward intention. They respond to structure. And when a structure benefits from your silence, it will protect that silence for as long as it can. This isn't a story about punishment. No one was publicly shamed. No one lost everything. What changed was far more subtle. Assumptions were forced into the light. And once that happens, they can't quietly govern outcomes anymore. I didn't win by speaking louder. I didn't win by demanding anything. I didn't even win by being right. What shifted things was accuracy, refusing to let my absence be rewritten as agreement, and refusing to keep smoothing over processes that depended on my invisibility. If there's a lesson here, it's not always speak up. Sometimes speaking too early only reinforces the roles you're trying to escape. The lesson is to understand why you're silent and who benefits from it. Silence chosen consciously is very different from silence assigned to you. I still believe in generosity. I still believe in empathy. But I no longer confuse either of those with self-erasure. Fairness doesn't arrive because you're patient enough. It arrives when the conditions for ignoring you no longer exist. If you've been quiet in rooms where decisions were being made about your life, I won't tell you what to do. Your situation is your own. But I will say this: pay attention to patterns, not promises. Pay attention to sequence, not reassurance. And don't underestimate the power of simply being precise. Sometimes the most decisive moment isn't when you finally speak. It's when you stop translating your silence into comfort for others. I'm curious to hear from you. Have you ever realized that staying quiet was helping someone else more than it was helping you? If you're comfortable, share your experience in the comments.
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ câu chuyện mới nhất. Hẹn gặp lại.